We're just so pleased this year to have with us Professor Robin D.G. Kelley. The Writer-in-Residence program, as many of you know, is part of a track in the graduate program in history and aims to help our students think seriously about writing for audiences beyond the academy. And I know we're in for a treat today because Robin spent yesterday afternoon with the students in my writing history seminar, which is a foundational course in that program, and we just had such a delightful talk. And so really looking forward to our conversation today. Before we get into all of that, I want to mention that tomorrow is another opportunity to hear Professor Kelley lecture. He's going to be talking about another project he's working on at Amherst College. And that talk is titled Seeking Soul's Sister, Grace Halsell and the Quest for a Compassionate World. That's at 4:30 tomorrow in the Pano Lecture Hall in the Benesky Museum of Natural History. And maybe we'll get a little clue about that at some point this afternoon. I promise I won't take a lot of your time before we get into the lecture for today, which is titled The Long Rise and Short Decline of American Democracy, but I do want to begin with a few words of thanks to some of the people who made today's event possible. First, of course, I want to recognize members of the History Department who make everything over there possible, principally Joy Bowman, our chair, as well as Mary Lashway, Suzanne Bell, and especially Amy Flag, who have done all the hard bureaucratic lifting to make anything possible at the university. And I'd also like to recognize our graduate assistant, Jill Dwiggins. Is Jill in the room somewhere? No, because there she is. Jill is tragically graduating, and I was just telling Professor Kelley we might not have to let that happen because we depend on her so much to run events in the history department. So thanks to Jill for everything she does. When we first started telling colleagues that our writer-in-residence this year was going to be Robin D.G. Kelley, people's excitement was palpable. I felt like I could feel the electricity coming back to me through the emails. And people just leapt forward to help support this event. So I have a happily long list of programs and departments to thank who have helped support this annual event and make it possible. So in addition to 5 Colleges, Inc., the main underwriter of this program since its inception, our 2013 program partners include the UMass Departments of English as well as Music, at Amherst College, the Departments of Black Studies, History, and American Studies, and at Hampshire, the School of Critical Inquiry and the Humanities. We're also deeply indebted to our several co-sponsors, the UMass Departments of Afro-American Studies, Political Science, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Mount Holyoke College Department of History, and the Smith College Departments of History, American Studies, and Afro-American Studies. So you can see this is truly an interdisciplinary effort here today. I also want to thank the bookstore for coming to this event. Diane's in the back and has several of Professor Kelley's titles if you want to pick one up at the end of the talk. And we also have some refreshments for you, cupcakes and other kinds of treats, so do avail yourselves of some late afternoon sugar or caffeine as needed. So when we sat down to think about this year's Writer-in-Residence, Robin Kelley came right to mind, not least because of the ways he connects to many of the themes that are swirling around campus this year, including the 50th anniversary of the death of W.E.B. Du Bois, the 40th anniversary of the music department, and also the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. Professor Kelley, who comes to us this week from UCLA, where he's the Gary Nash Professor of History, is the author of a seminal and revisionist study of the American South, Hammer and Hoe, which won several awards on publication and continues to be a standard work on the post-Civil War South. More recently, he's explored themes in music and culture, work that led to his book, Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz in Revolutionary Times, as well as the well-received biography of Thelonious Monk, which has also attracted widespread praise, not to mention several awards. And the Thelonious Monk biography was the topic we talked about in my seminar yesterday. And I have to say, it's a rigorous study of music and the music industry of the 20th century US, but it's also a really wonderful story of a man and his family, wonderfully humane in the telling. So I very much enjoyed that and recommend it to you all heartily. But Professor Kelley, in addition to being a path-breaking historian, is also a public intellectual whose writings have appeared in The Nation, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and a range of other venues. His pieces step with extraordinary agility from the scholarship of historians and other social scientists to the pressing issues of our time. It's no surprise that Professor Kelley told one interviewer, "I didn't study history to be a historian. I studied history to solve a series of political problems." And that, I believe, is what we're going to hear about this afternoon in Professor Kelley's talk, The Long Rise and Short Decline of American Democracy. Please welcome Robin D.G. Kelley.
Thank you for that really wonderful introduction, and also for your patience, Marla, with me, because I'm the most disorganized person. I don't respond to emails all the time, as some people know. I try, you know. And so it's been really wonderful, and it's been great being here. I have to thank everybody I've encountered, all the students, I can't name everybody, all my colleagues here, especially, of course, Professor Miller, of course, Joy Bowman, Jennifer Funk, who can't be here, was very, very helpful. I'd also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the people on whose land we gather, the Bokumtuk and the Nipmuc peoples. And I also want to just acknowledge being in the home place of Dr. W.E. Du Bois. And if you don't know it, there is a movement afoot right now to recognize him with some kind of plaque, some kind of something. And so I'm going to try to do what I can to help that process along. If you don't know about this movement, you should find out and do what you can, because there's no possible way that Dr. Du Bois shouldn't be recognized in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Okay, now this talk, I kind of came up with this idea around the time of the elections last year. So I have been thinking about it for a long time. And I came up with it in a moment of weakness. You know, I'm frustrated by the level of political discourse, the absence of historical perspective, even the idea that voter suppression is this new thing, you know, when in fact this has been the history of our democracy. And then, of course, Ann Coulter pissed me off, as she always does. She writes this book called Mugged, in which Republicans are the civil rights heroes. And might be for another century, but we'll talk about that in a second. Democrats are the real racists, and black people are both the passive victims and self-victimizing. And all this just really depressed me. So in this fit of frustration, I came up with this idea to write a book. As I started to delve into it, I'm not sure if I can do that, because it's really hard. So, but let me begin with 3 anecdotes that really illustrate my own frustration and what I've been thinking about how little Americans know about democracy. The first has to do with the Voting Rights Act, which of course is on everyone's mind now. We all know that the Supreme Court will probably gut the act or acts, removing Section 5 of the preclearance provision. And everyone's heard the quote by Justice Scalia that the act represents, quote, the perpetuation of racial entitlement, okay? And of course, this has been read to mean that the vote is a racial entitlement, which of course sends liberals and progressives, you know, going crazy. A couple of things. One, he is right. Historically, the vote has been a racial entitlement. It really has been. The Voting Rights Act was meant to end that racial entitlement. And secondly, and this is the thing that's more disturbing to me, because, you know, there's a reason why Scalia says what he says. I'll get to that in a second. But secondly, popular opinion in the media has actually framed the act as a kind of entitlement already by framing the civil rights movement that compelled Congress to pass this legislation as a proponent of black rights. We think of the civil rights movement as a proponent of black rights. In other words, it's like an interest group. You know, we use this interest group language. And there's kind of an unspoken presumption that the Voting Rights Act only protected black voters. This is why, some of you may remember, particularly black people who use the internet, that, you know, when the key provisions of the 1982 Voting Rights Act were scheduled to expire in the summer of 2007, there was this internet legend that circulated that said, you know, our right to vote will expire in the year 2007. But the fact is, the civil rights movement was not a black rights movement. It wasn't about black rights and privileges. It was a struggle to actually create democracy in the United States, you know, for everybody. And the point of the act is to protect all people vulnerable to systematic voting violations. In 1975, for example, when the act was extended in another 7 years, it was also enlarged to cover so-called language minorities, including Latinos, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, and Asian Americans, and it required jurisdictions with sizable so-called language minorities to provide translated ballots and related materials, and also to have translators available at the polls. That's just one of the provisions. There's many provisions that are meant to protect voting rights, period. But as long as the fate of the Voting Rights Act is seen as a black thing, I doubt there will be significant mobilization to defend it. And this is the point, especially the pre-clearance provision. And Scalia knows this, which is why calling it a racial entitlement is like a brilliant move on his part. It means that all y'all don't have to worry about it. Just the black people, you know? And it's just part of our own collective ignorance. That's one anecdote. The other one has to do with my son, Azizi. And I planned to do a PowerPoint, but I ran out of time because he has his picture. But Azizi comes home. He's 10. At this time, he is 7 years old. He's 10 now. Comes home one day and he says, you know, Will told me black people are half human. And so my wife and I are like, what? Huh? Of course, he goes to some private school, bunch of white kids and stuff. So we're pissed. We're about to go on camp. We're about to go to school and burn it down, right? So I'm aghast, pissed, but then I start to listen to what he says. And I said, this doesn't make sense because Will is, you know, good kid, liberal kid, parents very liberal. What could happen? So I call Will's mother. And Will's mother's like, oh, that's horrible. Oh, God, I can't believe I said, oh, no, he must be hanging out with Oliver. You know? So it turns out they were watching a film about the history of Black America. And in that film, it mentioned something about black people being reduced to 3/5 of a man. Okay? Now, the problem is that nobody understood what this meant, not even the parents. They're like, oh God, you know? So this is what I did. I turned this crisis into a teachable moment. I went to his class of first graders and explained to first graders the clause in the Constitution that allowed Southern slave-holding states to have more congressmen and therefore more electoral college votes than Northern states by counting 3 out of 5 enslaved people, 60%, as part of the general population, though enslaved people could not vote and were not citizens. I then explained to 7-year-olds that once the 14th and 15th Amendment were ratified, this compromise officially ended, but after white supremacists disenfranchised black Southerners after 1890 and on, it still created a massive imbalance since Southern states could count 100% of the black population without granting them the right to vote. Right? And if you ever read Color and Democracy, Du Bois' wonderful text, he actually gives you the numbers. I think it's like Southern representatives, you know, represented, one congressman represented like 44,000 voters, whereas in the Northeast, it was like 130,000, right? So of course, I got the parents in the room, I got the teachers in the room, I got the kids, and they're all like, oh, they never understood what that 3/5 thing was. They thought they literally were being cut in half. You know, the parents weren't any better. So this is part of what I'm dealing with. So finally, the last anecdote has to do with how Tom Brokaw wrecked my Valentine's Day. This is 2011. So it's like, you know, candlelight dinner. The bath is running. Got candles around the bathtub. We've got one of those really big bathtubs, right? So I'm ready, waiting for the bathtub to fill. It's about, you know, 11:40, 11:50, and Brokaw's and Dave Letterman. So, and he's pontificating about Hosni Mubarak and his decision to step down as president in face of revolution. So Brokaw tried to put the events in Egypt in context, citing how popular uprisings in Iran, the former Soviet Union, and South Africa have failed to produce the kind of flourishing democracy that we enjoy here in the United States. And he cautioned, quote, it doesn't necessarily mean that once you have street protests and the president quits, Jeffersonian democracy will bloom, okay? So, of course, I'm like choking on my ice cream, and I can't believe my ears. Here's this learned man who either believes that the democracy we have now is Jeffersonian, coming full-blown in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution with just a few tweaks to the Constitution over the years, or that democracy develops along an evolutionary schema, with the creation of a republic of small landholders being a first step on the road to a mature, modern democratic society. So of course I'm shouting back at the TV that Egyptians don't want to roll back history to Jeffersonian democracy, right? The republic ruled by white, male property owners when property included actual human beings. When those who lived in states owned human beings were granted more congressional representation than those who did not. When workers and farmers' revolts for greater political and economic access gave birth to anti-sedition laws. When the vast majority of the nation's inhabitants simply had no rights under the law. Particularly galling for me was Brokaw's presumption that the US ought to be the sole model for the world. No matter what we might think about South Africa, for example, and there are lots of problems, but its constitution is actually more expansive than our own. It includes language rights, explicit provisions against discrimination, protects reproductive rights. Gee, isn't that interesting? I mean, there's a movement afoot to try to create an amendment to the Constitution, now the Margaret Sanger Amendment. In any case, it protects the right to join a trade union in the Constitution, and the right to an environment that is not harmful to the people's health or well-being, end quote, among other things. And also the level of mass political participation is much greater than what we've seen in the US in generations. That doesn't mean that it's not suffering under kind of neoliberal policies. And I'm not trying to celebrate South Africa, I'm saying just on paper, that document actually looks really good. Now, I also found it ironic that as Brokaw was droning on about the virtues of Jeffersonian democracy, our own federal government at the time and still was spying on citizens suspected of terrorism, which includes American environmental justice activists, denying the right of habeas corpus for others, which includes those who are being deported. That legislation, by the way, goes back to Bill Clinton. Authorizing the military to detain such suspects, including US citizens, indefinitely without charge. And letting several massive Wall Street firms clearly guilty of prosecutable crimes go scot-free. State governments were outlawing collective bargaining rights for trade unions, passing legislation severely constricting women's reproductive rights, replacing democratically elected local officials with emergency financial managers as a way to privatize public lands, public schools, and to render union contracts null and void, all in the name of austerity. And if you pay attention to the news, the latest target right now is Detroit, where people are just being completely disenfranchised. And besides, the latest efforts at voter suppression, besides all those efforts at voter suppression, which we witnessed, 2010, 2012, residents of Washington, D.C. are still denied congressional representation. The people of Puerto Rico and Guam and Virgin Islands effectively cannot vote in federal elections. And some 5.85 million people are disenfranchised permanently or temporarily because they have been convicted of a felony. This group represents, the last group represents about 8% of the black voting age population. I was talking to students this morning about how as little as 5% of the black voting age population, black voters, have decided elections in the past, right? Even the 1948 election, pay attention. So it hit me just how little we know. I'm gonna turn this side. Can't see, getting old. It hit me just how little we know outside the halls of academia about how our present-day democracy came into being, or even recognize that as the Arab world, Africa, Latin America are either establishing or expanding democracy in their respective countries, often in spite of US foreign policy, right? Here at home, our own short-lived democracy is in peril. And yes, I meant to say short-lived. Most sophisticated, well-read people, that would be you, right, agree that the modern, representative, multiracial democracy that we now take for granted is less than a half century old. This is no revelation, especially once you step outside the American spectacle. And as Jeff Beaulieu writes in his magnum opus, Forging Democracy, The History of the Left in Europe, 1859 to 2000, he asked the question, what does democracy mean? In the realm of law, it requires at least the following: free, universal, secret, adult, and equal suffrage, the classic civil freedoms of speech, conscience, assembly, association, and the press, and freedom from arrest without trial. By this standard, democracy was achieved nowhere in the world during the 19th century. Okay? Now note here he uses the word achieved. The point of Ely's text, and much of the work upon which it is based, is that democracy was struggled for, less by the great theorists of democracy than by working people, the dispossessed, chartists, women's groups, bonded and former enslaved, etc. And as we all know, it wasn't just about achieving the vote in a representative democracy, it was about many things, from defending the Magna Carta's principles of habeas corpus, or the right to the commons, to securing decent wages for work, the right to assemble and form associations, the right to dissent, or ending forms of bondage rooted in systems of patriarchy, race, class, colonialism, etc. And yet, in this country, it is widely accepted that the necessary components of our democracy had already been laid out in the Constitution by a handful of visionary property men. Case in point, I remember when the House Republicans were doing this thing where they would read the Constitution, and then they would edit out the parts about slavery. This act is very well known. We all know that, right? And that's not the interesting part. For me, what's interesting is the press coverage, especially from liberal publications. Headlines criticize Republicans for leaving out the icky, offensive, arcane, politically uncomfortable parts of the Constitution, as if the protection of slavery as a property right and the use of slaves to expand congressional representation and taxation were merely mistakes by the founding fathers, who were just men of their time. That's how they would describe it. In fact, New York Times had this whole exchange about the 3/5 compromise and all that stuff, about, it's a moral issue. And I'm like, I was talking to John Higginson about this yesterday. Read your John Locke. Just go to school. Well, that's right. They're gutting schools, but just read John Locke about natural rights. Anyway, we can get into that. The critics argued that acknowledging this error does not soil the magnificence of the greatest document the world has ever known. The problem, of course, is that slavery was not an aberration, but foundational not only to the American economy, but to the very shape of the republic. And property ownership was a prerequisite for the franchise, which initially was not a right, but a privilege. Okay? It was a racial privilege. Now students, of course, all the students here, I'm sure, read the Federalist Papers, and I'm sure all you freshmen have read debates between Hamilton and Madison and Hayes. Am I right about that? Yeah, I'm assuming that. And learn about how democracy expanded dramatically in the era of Jackson with the elimination of property requirements, the growth of the mass press, and the creation of a vibrant public sphere for white men to engage in public or political debate. Now, what students don't always learn is that as suffrage is being granted to white working class men, which is a revolutionary process, free black men, property owners among them, okay, this is important, are losing the vote, right? In New York in 1821, in Pennsylvania in 1838, respectively, they removed property requirements for voting and prescribed black male suffrage simultaneously, one fell swoop, okay? So they would make basically clear, universal suffrage means white men, right? Black men, because there was no female suffrage then, but black men who had the right to vote lost it as they extended the vote to working class white men, okay? From 1819 to the Civil War, every state admitted to the Union limited the franchise to white males in their constitutions. By 1860, only 6% of the northern black population lived in states in which they could vote. Half of the eligible voters in these states were kept from the polls through violence and intimidation, okay? Now, I know a lot of you here are very sophisticated. In fact, you have the greatest history department in the country, I have to say. And I come from a very good history department at UCLA, but the people here, I look at your work, I read it, and I'm astounded, and I'm almost embarrassed by stepping into territory that you all have mastered. So please cut me some slack. But having said that, many of you, of course, are familiar with terms like Herrenvolk democracy. If you young people are not, you should look it up. Read Pierre Vandenberg, he coined the term. Or you probably read Alexander Saxton, Dave Roediger, or Joel Olson's Abolition of White Democracy. But my point is that even in the best US history surveys, the expansion of Jacksonian democracy, slave revolts, in a series of compromises with southern states and around the question of slavery are always treated as parallel tracks, not treated as the same process. They're sort of discrete stories. There's no singular story of this as forging American democracy. Why is that? Well, part of it is because we're taught to see American democracy as a creed rather than a process. And certainly, I mean, I think President Obama uses creed more than he uses black. He's always talking about the creed, our creed, a creed that's handed down to us from on high. Now, where there's conflict or problems is because some force or some movement or power violates that creed, right? As a nation, we take it for granted that all of us, especially women, racialized groups, immigrants, working people, the subjugated and dispossessed, are in fact beneficiaries of the elites, not the architects of democracy. And I want to flip it and argue that these very people are not only the architects of our modern democracy, but producers of political theory. While the true genius of the drafters of the Constitution, and I don't want to take anything away from the Constitution because it's a very important document, and the Bill of Rights, have been to limit government power so as to preclude the rise of an oligarchy, monarchy, or dictatorship. And at least in theory, it set the stage or laid the framework to protect fundamental civil rights for a tiny minority. But they did not establish what we think of today as a modern democracy. Okay? It didn't come to being then. More importantly, many movements of the dispossessed who fought hard to establish democracy, sometimes for the inclusion of some, sometimes for the inclusion of all, actually produced ideas, theories, visions of what democracy ought to look like, which extend far beyond the basic framework of the Constitution. Economic rights, social justice, and what have become known as human rights found voice in all of these movements. And sometimes they succeeded in at least temporarily implementing these sorts of demands and reforms. Now, I have a lot of caveats about this talk, too many to discuss, but the biggest one is that I'm really just beginning to think deeply about some of these things. So if I make arguments that have already been made before, or texts that I haven't read, you have to forgive me. I'm speaking more from a place of urgency and exuberance than wisdom per se, but hope that could generate a conversation. And secondly, I'm not trying to take on political theory. Of course, I'm aware of iconic theorists, John Rawls, Robert Dahl, in the more recent debates between proponents of deliberative democracy, people like Amy Gutman, Dennis Thompson, Bruce Ackerman, James Fishkin, all those people, and in democratic realists like Sheldon Wolin, Judith Sklar, Michael Walzer, Ian Shapiro, Chantal Mouffe, John Donne. And I learned a lot from reading works like Mark Steer's Demanding Democracy and others. And I understand and sympathize with the argument that we actually need a more socially just, deliberative form of democracy, one more open than the judicial and legislative process, a system that's shot through with money and determined by power. And I also understand the realist argument, their pessimism about the inability to generate meaningful, sustainable solidarity in the face of self-interest, inequality, and coercion. But to my mind, I don't find either of these schools of thought satisfying, since politics, like everything else, is historically contingent and has to be constantly, continually remade and reproduced. And solidarities shift. They shift along with changes in social conditions and relations. They shift as a result of self-interest. Self-interest is not some natural, discrete, objective reality, but ideological and discursive. Even the concept of identity, like who is the self and self-interest, for example, changes. It's contested, it's transformed, right? And interest is equally contingent, even ephemeral, which is why a lot of those of us who study social movements try to avoid easy claims about groups acting in their self-interest or against their self-interest. I mean, sometimes we use that phrase, but we also kind of, bracket it a little bit. So finally, the question of power is fundamental here. It is real, but it is also contested. Democratic realists often treat power as a kind of fixed variable. Deliberative Democrats as a ground, a playing field that government institutions must try to sort of make level for the good of society. So with the time I have left, I want to do two things. One, give a sketch of what a different history of the rise of democracy might look like. Not entire history, but just a couple of examples from my own thinking of crucial moments. And then secondly, and this is the decline, and unfortunately, because I was running out of time in my hotel trying to get this talk together, the second part is really short. But I really want to reflect a bit what it means for democracy that the achievement of universal suffrage for the first time in US history converges with the decline of the social wage and the ascendance of neoliberalism. These things come together. Okay, that's the last part I want to get at, is leave it as a set of questions. Now, the architecture for our modern democracy was first established with the end of slavery. And its primary, though not sole architects, were the former slaves themselves. That's an argument. I'm not the first to make that argument. In fact, for a particularly really persuasive and powerful interpretation of this history, you have to look at Manisha Sinha's forthcoming book, The Slave's Cause, Abolition, and the Origins of America's Interracial Democracy. I stay up at night waiting for that book to pop up on Amazon because I can't wait to read it. But this is the argument. And of course, this argument grows out of the seeds that W.B. Du Bois gave us. In fact, it was Du Bois who presciently called this abolition democracy. That is, the struggles waged by free black people, abolitionists, women suffragists, free labor advocates, and especially the enslaved people themselves, to expand democracy and end all forms of slavery. And that struggle, and this is really central to his argument, created a political and social crisis that led to war. Okay? While the war was about slavery, and we recognize that, even Steven Spielberg recognizes that, although that's a tricky thing. It was also fundamentally about expanding democracy. Okay? That Civil War was about expanding democracy. Du Bois wasn't the first to say this, and I suspect that this argument was actually circulating in the 19th century among radicals after the war. I mean, even Susan B. Anthony, in an address to the Democratic Party in 1868, stated, quote, "The late war, seemingly in the interest of slavery, was fought by unseen hands for the larger liberties of the whole people. It was not a war between North and South, for the principle of class and caste knows neither latitude or longitude. It was a war of ideas, of aristocracy and democracy, of capital and labor, the same that has convulsed the race through the ages, and will continue to convulse future generations, until justice and equality shall reign upon the earth." Okay? Now here, Anthony actually anticipates Du Bois's trenchant insights, and of course makes the case for women's suffrage, along with the emancipation of wage labor as the crucial battleground, I should say that, for the coming years. Okay. The Democrats, she proclaimed, had a history of extending the suffrage. Despite the fact that, if you know your history, the Republican Party actually was much more active in supporting women's suffrage at this point. But she's trying to extend and get more support because Republicans were kind of slow. So she's appealing to the Democrats of the Jacksonian period. And she's appealing to them because they were the ones that fought for the repeal of property requirements. Now, she does not criticize the government for enfranchising black men and granting citizenship to black people, but she does imply that denying, quote, 15 million white women the votes cast them the vote, cast them under the heel of the lowest orders of manhood. Okay? Now this, of course, sets the stage for the suffrage movement's Gilded Age defeats, their setbacks. And that's a period when some of the leading proponents embraced racist arguments for inclusion based on white women's superiority and Americanness, because also anti-immigrant, over men of color and lowly immigrants. And it's not until they build a strong working class base and turn to direct action that the suffrage movement gains traction, and even if it wasn't fully inclusive then. But let's go back to Reconstruction. Now, I'm one of those who believe that the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments represent a significant revision of the original Constitution. You know, it's like a revision of that Constitution, and paved the way for the actual creation of democracy in the United States for the first time. But that movement was defeated economically, legislatively, judicially, and militarily, ultimately opening the way for the rise of an oligarchy, great concentrations of wealth, imperialism, and a Supreme Court that rules in favor of property rights and corporate power over people. And yet, there are a couple things worth considering here. One, the free people's democratic vision radically differed from that of their former masters and northern capitalists. And this is Du Bois's point. Some of this we know from the demands put forward by various civic, community, and political organizations. And some of these ideas they inscribed in state constitutions. In fact, remember, those state constitutions were among the most progressive state constitutions in the history of the United States, you know, during the radical Reconstruction phase. They expected the state to provide economic support for those in need, to protect its citizens from violence and exploitation, though this also meant the right to armed self-defense, to provide good, free, universal public education, housing, public services for all people. They weren't trying to write them for black people. To work actively to achieve and defend equality, to abolish imprisonment for debt, okay? Public whipping, to provide funds for roads and railroad construction and other improvements, and to seize lands from former criminals, that is the rebels, the masters, and distribute that land to free people as reparations for unpaid wages. And in fact, and here's an argument, it's kind of controversial, but I would argue that it is in Reconstruction that you find the beginnings of American social democracy. It's not the progressive era. It's not even the populist. You know, I mean, I take the wonderful work by Charles Postel and all those other people about the populist movement, but no, here is the beginnings of social democracy. And maybe not even just for the United States, but maybe for the rest of the world, okay? And then there's a question of democratic practice. Scholarship going way back to like Elsa Barkley Brown and Julie Saville, as well as scholarship later developed by Stephen Hahn, Greg Barron, and others, support Du Bois's speculations that former slaves created a new kind of democracy after emancipation, a democracy that emphasized diffused power and broad participation. We see this in black families on the ground, women and children attend Republican conventions. You know, could you imagine like everyone coming to the convention, and when they call the vote, everyone raises their hand, even 6-year-old Johnny, you know? They did not hesitate to participate. The vote was seen as collectively owned, not a man's right. Women accompanied men to the voting booths and told them how to vote. But then I don't want to romanticize. This is not a period of women's emancipation, certainly not for black women. This is also a period of immense sexual violence, other forms of violence, patriarchal authority, and state violence, and familial power prevailed. Now, I don't accept the argument that the withdrawal of federal troops from the South marked the end of the democratic experiment we call Reconstruction. The fact is, some of the most intense biracial or multiracial struggles for democracy erupt after the official end of Reconstruction. In fact, for the last 15 years in my survey courses, I've been arguing that the last sigh of democratic struggles in the South took place in the 1880s and 1890s, with the most amazing coalitions formed by the Greenback Labor Party, the Readjusters, the Knights of Labor, the fusion tickets with Republicans and populists. And some fought to defend voting rights for black people. They fought to raise wages. I have it split here. To raise wages and to improve working conditions. And in some cases, they were fighting to overthrow kind of corporate power and create social democracy. Now, one of the great works of political thought to come out of this movement was a book by T. Thomas Fortune, called Black and White, Land, Labor, and Politics in the South. It was published in 1884. How many people have read that book? T. Thomas Fortune, raise your hand. Okay, this is one of these books that it should be like necessary reading. It should be like, if you read Locke, you should read Fortune. He calls the U.S. a tyranny. He excoriates the government for failing to protect black civil rights and black lives, for maintaining a system that reproduces poverty for all working people. He criticizes those who claim slaveholders deserve compensation for lost slaves, and actually argues the opposite, that enslaved people deserve reparations. He identifies land monopoly as the critical source of wealth inequality. And he draws on the Magna Carta to insist on a return to the commons. Okay? And as he wrote in his book, I maintain that land is common property, the property of the whole people, and that it cannot be alienated from the people without producing the most fearful consequences. And although, like Henry George, he advocated a single tax, ultimately, he didn't believe a single tax is going to work. He believed that the only way to solve these problems was through interracial united working class action. That was his position. Now, the last vestiges of Southern populist labor abolition democracy was defeated through force and violence, culminating in a coup d'etat in Wilmington in 1898. I'm surprised people call it a race riot. Wilmington was not a race riot. It was elected officials being forced out of position by gunpoint and people being shot and killed in the process. That's what it was, a coup d'etat. If it happened in Latin America, we call it a coup d'etat. You know, in North Carolina, it is a coup d'etat. So this is why it's not an accident that formal disfranchisement doesn't really begin until 1890. So it's really like that 1890s, Mississippi's first, and then it goes into stages. And then lynching doesn't really take off as a practice until the late 19th century, and segregation as well. So the story doesn't end in the South. The struggle over the franchise was nationwide, right here in Massachusetts. Property requirements were not abolished until 1891. In Rhode Island, property requirements had been imposed on the foreign-born, on immigrants, in the 1840s and stayed in place until 1888. And at the same time, property requirements were being extended in municipal elections around the country. Pennsylvania limited the franchise to taxpayers until the 1930s. Poor people in particular were targets of disenfranchisement. About a dozen states denied the right to vote to anyone receiving public assistance, public aid, and 4 other states excluded residents of poorhouses and charitable institutions directly. Others were denied indirectly because, if you live in a poorhouse, you can't establish residency, So people were denied the right to vote. Then, of course, this wave of xenophobia dramatically curtailed the rights of non-citizens who, in the age of continental expansion, were essentially, were actually really important to being able to get states into the Union. In other words, you want to get as many votes as possible, so it didn't matter if someone was a non-citizen. It mattered by the Gilded Age. And again, I want to stress that this was a struggle. The rich, under the influence of ideologists like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, were pushing to limit the franchise. They wanted to restore property requirements. They wanted to impose literacy requirements. In fact, they didn't trust universal suffrage. And yet, the pushback from labor, from populists and their allies gave us all these things that we take for granted now. The ballot initiative, the referendum, the recall, direct primaries, the 17th Amendment. And we all know the 17th Amendment because, of course, you read your Constitution every other day, which is direct election of senators. It's a populist demand. But again, these were 20th century developments. Pushback against an oligarchy that's trying to limit the franchise. So again, it's a struggle. And yet, let me just quickly move here. I just want to say a few words about democracy and empire. Now, I doubt anyone here thinks U.S. empire began in 1898. We now generally accept this idea that the imperial character of the United States was there at the beginning of the nation. Okay. So that westward expansion was itself empire building through international war, the subjugation of indigenous peoples, and also the fact that the U.S. was founded as a settler colonial regime. I think most people accept that. That said, I also want to suggest one of the great ironies, though I don't think it's ironic, I think it's endemic, of the post-Gilded Age era and the rise of progressivism is that it occurs with the expansion of U.S. empire abroad, where incidents of direct intervention begin to accelerate, often under the guise of protecting U.S. interests and spreading democracy to subject peoples. But again, it's not to expand the settler colonial nation state to make it bigger. These regimes abroad, from the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, to Haiti, Dominican Republic, Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua, are examples of the worst excesses of military rule. Now here, we historians and cultural critics tend to link the story of overseas empire to industrialization in a very Leninist fashion. That is, it's about opening new markets for surplus, I should say J. Hobson, but exploiting cheaper labor, expanding consumption, geopolitical power. This is the reason for U.S. expansion. And then there's some of us who see empire as expressions of masculinity, when industrialization, dislocation, joblessness were seen as assaults on American manhood. And these are all valid and important and persuasive arguments. But consider this. Consider how empire might have actually shaped both existing U.S. democracy and theories of democracy, especially in light of the period, a period when the very moment when multiracial democracy is being defeated in the South, when a revitalized left challenges the oligarchy of capital and a hodgepodge of technocrats, reformers, labor leaders, suffragists, pragmatists, all grouped together under this unwieldy category known as progressives, try to manage or reform capital, eliminating its worst excesses and pushing for greater democratization. When the international scramble for colonies actually intensifies, leading to world war. When U.S. global hegemony, or at least the possibilities of the U.S. becoming the preeminent power, has become an accepted fact. Okay? When scientific theories of race, eugenics, and the like have achieved the status of common sense and significantly shaped political theory. And what happens in this period, roughly from 1890 to about 1920, is a kind of flowering of texts that muse on the shape of American democracy in light of racial change, immigration, and the transformation of the modern city and the growth of empire. The number of books that come out is astounding. Everyone's trying to theorize or think about democracy. And they're trying to think about how does democracy work under the regulatory state? How does democracy work under industrialization? And so you get these books, William Hartpole, Democracy and Liberty, Herbert Crowley, Progressive Democracy, Clifford Douglas, Economic Democracy, Walter Wilde, The New Democracy, William McDougall, Is America Safe Under Democracy? Max Hirsch, Democracy versus Socialism, John Dewey, Democracy and Education, Julius Drexler, Democracy and Assimilation, and on and on. And I'm not suggesting there's anything close to a consensus here, but rather there's a real debate over the future of American democracy. And the one thing these authors seem to agree on is that democracy's future is not settled. Indeed, it's surprising how many readers insist that the US has actually not achieved democracy. And this is like 19-teens and by 1920. I'll give you two examples here. Frederick Clemson Howe wrote this book called The City, The Hope of Democracy, 1905. And when you read it, you would swear it's the foundation for the Right to the City movement comes out of this book. And he writes, as a matter of fact, we nowhere have a democratic government. What we really have is a government by special privileges and big businessmen. And in fact, Howe's text anticipates, that's it, the Right to the City movement. He blames big capital, privatization, and monopoly for undermining democracy, and the condition of labor by pushing for limiting the franchise to property and native born. He also takes issue with the argument that poverty is caused by bad behavior or poor choices or evolution, and he cites instead social and structural factors. He insisted that a new democracy was on the horizon and the city would be its birthplace, but it would require a program that included municipal ownership of utilities, improved public schools, cooperatives, healthcare clinics, etc. And all these functions, he writes, are in a sense socialistic, but it is such activities as these, it is the care and protection of the people that inspire love and affection for the city. For these new activities will enlarge your life, not limit it, will ensure freedom, not destroy it. Okay? This may seem visionary, but we have to remember one thing, and that is that the industrial working class, as we know it, was a new phenomenon in the late 19th century. It wasn't that new, the rapid expansion of industrialization. So it wasn't clear what role industrial workers would play in governing the society. See, we take it for granted that we sort of know the governing structure and the workers will never govern, but that's not clear. And it's not an accident that Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb published Industrial Democracy in 1897, around this time. I'm going to skip over Franklin Giddings and Democracy and Empire, but just to say that it's some crazy writings in this period that make the argument that democratic empire is the project. That, in fact, the expansion of empire is about creating democracy, and this is how we're going to do it. And there's lots of people who make this argument, and I'm going to skip all that and just say that none of this reflection, theorizing, and hand-wringing acknowledges the reality that the violence of colonial domination represents the very antithesis of democracy, or that anti-imperialist opposition often represents the clearest, most consistent voices for democratic transformation, especially as the older forms of rule crumble. We see it in the resistance movements that emerged in Hawaii, in Nicaragua, in the Dominican Republic, and in Haiti. And we certainly see it in Mexico, where the revolution on the border raised the specter of a hemispheric revolution that threatened U.S. hegemony. Indeed, when I teach U.S. history, and I know people are going to be mad at me for that, except for those who agree with me, I'd say the book is wrong. I said Eric Foner's wrong. The book is wrong. U.S. entry into World War I begins with the invasion of Haiti, the occupation. There's already a war going on, and this is the Western Front. The Western Hemisphere is the Western Front. And the U.S. is not really neutral, right? So you got all these battles taking place. Dominican Republic, 1916, Haiti, 1915, and all these military excursions into Mexico in 1917. You say, World War, huh? What? This is consistent with the wars in Europe, which were also largely about territory and colonies. The Wilson administration dispatched military might to protect U.S. investments, bank loans, corporate agriculture, and by 1914, U.S. investments in the Caribbean accounted for $1.3 billion. In Mexico alone, U.S. had invested about $500 million at the start of the revolution. So imagine the threat it posed when Mexico, even under a liberal constitutionalist like Carranza, began pushing for social democracy, expanding workers' rights and power, and pushing for greater sovereignty over its resources. So you got the Constitution of 1917, which laid the basis for an assault on the hacienda. It weakened the power of the church. It introduced protections for workers' rights, including an 8-hour day and the right to organize. And it regulated the operation of foreign capital in Mexico, which included state ownership of lands, waters, and subsoil rights. Now, that was defeated. But at the time, it represented a real threat. And this is why you take something as basic as anti-immigrant laws. And the anti-immigrant laws and anti-sedition laws and criminal syndicalist laws were in fact considered almost one and the same. Judges had begun to apply a political litmus test to potential citizens, refusing applicants whom they deemed sympathetic to the principles of socialism or trade unionism. And in 1912, there was a federal judge in Seattle who actually revoked the citizenship of a naturalized citizen who espoused socialism. So part of my argument is that the state wasn't entirely wrong to fear subversive politics of the foreign born. This is what Sacco Vanzetti was about. We see this even more clearly in this brilliant book by Jennifer Guglielmo. It's called Living the Revolution, which documents the role of Italian immigrant women in radical movements in the Northeast. You consider the fact that M.N. Roy, the Indian radical, the founder of the Indian Communist Party, is in the United States, in San Francisco, is going to Mexico, is organizing everywhere. Carlos Bulasan, the Filipino radical, these people are bringing with them all kinds of traditions and practices to the United States, and they represent a subversive threat. And closer to the border, the US security state is investing a whole lot of resources in harassing and imprisoning Mexican anarchists like Ricardo Flores Magón and his brothers Enrique and Jesus and Maria Talavera. And they were active in the effort to overthrow the Diaz regime. They were mobilizing support for anarchism in Los Angeles in the early 20th century. They were organizing for the IWW. They were pushing the Mexican Revolution to the left, or trying to. And where did Ricardo end up? Well, he ended up in Leavenworth. What was it, because he was an undocumented immigrant? No, they got him under the Anti-Labor Espionage Act of 1917, right? So what some of this suggests, this sort of takeaway from this, one of the takeaways, is that in writing a history of democracy, we really have to uncouple citizenship. Sometimes we focus so much on the question of citizenship that we don't realize that the most important architects of democracy were those who did not enjoy citizenship. They enjoyed partial citizenship or none at all. And remember, those black people I talked about were not citizens of the United States until the 14th Amendment. Now, if we quickly leap into the second half of the 20th century, when US empire indirectly expanded, this coincides with the radical expansion of democracy. Joshua Freeman talks about this as kind of the key paradox, defining the history of post-war America. And he writes a book called American Empire, The Rise of Global Power, The Democratic Revolution at Home. And it's a very wonderful book. But for me, it is a paradox. It was a convergence. Multiracial movements to democratize America actually begin as resistance to the expanding national security state and US imperialism. Let me just repeat that, okay, because I think it's important. And maybe it's just important to me, but I'm the one talking right now. Multiracial movements to democratize America in this period, in the post-Cold War period, post-war period, begin as resistance to the expanding national security state and US imperialism. That is the anti-war movement, the free speech movement. Civil rights was already on the agenda. There was no period when there was no civil rights movement. It's not new at all, but it does take off in part because of international Cold War pressures on our national government from the Soviet bloc and non-aligned nations, undercutting US imperial designs. And even the argument that the movement was about forcing the nation to live up to its creed has been discredited. That's not true. Nobody believes that. It was like, it's sort of like the Civil War. The Civil War was a struggle for democracy, and its southern origins have much to do with the fact that it was the last bastion of disenfranchisement. Civil rights movement, it's a struggle for democracy. And the South was the last bastion of disenfranchisement. And still, as Alex Kesar reminds us, while the Voting Rights Act was the heart of the movement for universal suffrage in this period, we also witnessed the elimination of poll taxes at the federal and state election level, literacy tests, pauper exclusion clauses, so-called good character provisions, understanding clauses, language barriers, burdensome residency requirements, the elimination of virtually all property and tax requirements for voting in special elections, not to mention the lowering of the voting age to 18. All of these changes occurred somewhere between 1964, 24th Amendment, and the late 1970s. So Kesar estimated that these changes taken together added about 20 million voters to the rolls. Now, of course, there's much more to the story, voter registration drives, Mississippi Freedom, I'm not going to talk about it, I don't have time, but I want to remind us that the victorious era, the era we celebrate, the 1960s, this is going to sound strange coming from me, Mr. Optimism, actually represents something of a defeat. The dismantling of the welfare state, the decline of the social wage, and the rise of neoliberalism, partly facilitated by the global economic crises of the 1970s. I think we have to recognize that the democratic revolution meant a counter-revolution. For all the victories, like the military defeat of the US in Vietnam, the Third World Project was dismantled. And why it was a complicated process I won't get into, you have destabilizations, assassinations, overthrow of democratically elected governments, installation of dictators in the service of US empire. That is the story. Vietnam is one exception to the dominant story, which is actually US victory in some ways. Jimmy Carter, along with Reagan and the Bushes, and certainly President Obama. As I said at Hampshire College 4 years ago, some of you may remember that. We are right to be concerned about money in politics, but we're missing the fundamental problem, and that is the reason that money actually matters. Part of it, we have a fairly passive citizenry, fascinated by spectacle, treating sound bites, stereotypes as ideology. And I think Chris Hedges is right to say that spectacle has replaced literacy. And yet, as the history of the late 19th and early 20th century reminds us, all the concentrated wealth in the world isn't enough to buy an oligarchy clothed as democracy. So long as there are progressive, radical, democratic movements building power from the bottom up, challenging the prevailing common sense with alternative visions of society and critiques of the system. And here I'm speaking of 99%, I Don't Know More, the community rights campaign, radical immigrant rights movements. It's not just about college-bound kids without papers, but an entire exploited working class criminalized for no papers. And this is what democracy ought to be. And it's clear to me that it cannot flourish and grow in the killing fields of neoliberalism. Thank you. So I'm sorry, I had so much stuff to talk about and I didn't get to it. So any questions, comments, thoughts from anybody? And I'm sorry, it's hot. I know it's cold outside though, to me. Well, yeah, I'll try to repeat it, but the mic's over there.
I'm gonna put it in.
Come on.
I think because they're filming it.
I can project.
Okay, good.
My question is actually, I don't know if that's on or not. Anyway,
Yeah.
My question is actually very simple, but it actually is a little more complicated. I think you've hit at it a little bit with your talk, but would you consider the United States to ever have been, I know this is sort of a nomenclature semantic thing, but having to teach my students about the Roman Republic, that would you ever consider the United States to be a democracy at all? Because I think that a republic is much, and we call ourselves a republic quite often, it's not the point is, have we ever been a democracy, and does that sort of shape the major fights, in my opinion, things like campaign finance reform, corporations and citizens, money sort of steering everything that happens with our particular government, that this sort of conflict guides what we consider to be, democracy versus what we really might be, which is republic and have always been.
Right.
So,
well, that's a very good question. I don't deny that the U.S. self-representation is as a republic. And part of what I would argue is that what a democracy is not a thing, but a process. And that part of what happens is that even political theorists debate about whether or not the sort of Athenian ideal of democracy has any relevance at all in the modern world. So if we think about so I qualified by saying the kind of the multiracial modern democracy that we imagine ourselves to be, that was a struggle. And the thing is, there's all these counterfactuals that are very interesting. Robert Dahl has these great counterfactuals about, what would happen if the US was a parliamentary system? And whether or not, not so much what is a democracy, but whether or not, say, parliamentary system is more democratic, meaning that you'd have to have a coalition government, for example. You wouldn't be bound by it. But what he's very clear about is that US democracy is its own animal. It's very, very specific. It's a two-party system. It comes out of a particular history of struggle and a certain set of relationships. It comes with changing nature of borders and border patrol. It comes with a certain history of xenophobia, a certain self-identity. And so so what I'm interested in thinking about is like, what are the historical processes that both produce the thing that we call democracy, which I agree, it doesn't achieve anything close to what people imagine it to be. It still hasn't. And in fact, part of my argument is it's shrinking as policies that appear to be free from the state are totally tied to the state. You know, but part of my sort of thinking about this is, what did it take? Who is responsible for opening and broadening the horizons of certain democratic practices that we have? How does that happen? And who is responsible for closing them down? So it's this. The history is this. It's constant struggle, which is really interesting. And none of it resembles any model that we've come to read. Now, I think there's real value in making a distinction between both republic and democracy, but also, as Seth Robinson would argue, a distinction between make a distinction between participatory democracy and representative democracy. And we have a representative democracy. We also have social movements in which participatory practice are central. So if I were to write a history of democracy, I'd have to figure out, okay, well, is that history too? Is the history of what happens inside the IWW or SNCC or any of these movements represent a kind of, not a blueprint, but a space for democratic practice? What does that look like? And what does it look like if we've already decided that there's only one narrative of the city in the late 19th, early 20th century? That is a narrative of corruption, of ethnic power, of patron-client relationships. That maybe something else is happening in the city. And maybe what's happening in the city may be certain democratic practices that people are bringing with them from places around the globe. But those are the things that need to be explored. I think historians are exploring now. So my thing is that if there's anything to take away from this, it's that whatever we have here is certainly not done. And whatever we might have had 40 years ago, it's not what we have now. And so the question is, are there issues having to do with the social wage, with economic issues, with the protections of the body, with, we can talk about sovereignty, sovereign rights, but not talk about sovereign rights of a woman's body, and not talk about whether or not, because in neoliberal vision, the old 18th century liberal vision, it's like sink or swim. Whether or not that is a violation of rights, So this is the kind of thing, these are the kind of discussions that are worth having to be able to make something else. But in the end, it's about power. So I appreciate that question. Yes. Hey, Rosa.
Robin, can you just speak to your recent experience in Palestine, your work with BDS, and in light of yesterday's announcement that there will now be separate buses for the Palestinian people in the West Bank?
Right, which doesn't surprise me at all. This is related to the topic and very, very important. Some of you may know, because I actually wrote about it, I was actually in the West Bank in January of 2012 and spent a few weeks there with a group involved in the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And part of that experience in those days, a year and some months ago, there was one transportation issue that was very, very important. This Veolia had this tram that they built. And the question was, who's going to have access? It basically was built between East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, and it was in violation of Geneva Conventions because you can't really build infrastructure in an occupied zone unless it's related to military issues. So there's a lot of protests, a lot of organizing around that. The issue of segregation doesn't surprise me. The fact that some Palestinian activists have taken on the sort of language and traditions of the freedom riders. It's kind of interesting, and that goes way back. It's also interesting because they're trying to connect these struggles. They're trying to sort of recognize that what exists there is a form of apartheid. Now, of course, I'm going to get a lot of people, a lot of pushback, and I know that this is suddenly going to be the topic, and no one's going to really care about what I have to say about democracy. But this is about democracy. And one of the things that I've tried to, not me, but many others have tried to argue, is that as much as the separate but unequal buses are perceived as a security measure, because that's the argument, it's a security measure, it's basically to keep people safe. The fact is, we know from the history of the United States that you can't have separate but equal. It's not possible. And more importantly, the only option available in some ways is democracy, is the expansion of democracy to all in any occupation, whatever that means. And it's getting more and more complicated because the more you occupy, the more you oppress, the more you tighten the vice grip, the more difficult it is to come up with like what they call a two-state solution, which is not realistic. The fact is, one of the great things that I was able to do when I was in Palestine and in Haifa was I met Palestinian and Israeli activists and intellectuals who were very, very clear. We need one democratic state. There's no other option. And that's across the board. And let me just throw one other thing out there, which is pretty interesting. There's a guy named Alex Lubin who teaches in Beirut, American University. Brilliant. Has this book coming out on kind of black freedom struggles in Palestine. And one of the things he argues, which I did not know, is that Ralph Bunche, who we think of as like the guy who brokered the deal to end the war, the Arab-Israeli war, the person who brokered the deal to create the state of Israel, that initially he was having these conversations with Israeli and Palestinian leftists who basically said there's only one option, and that is a binational state. That was in 1948, right? That idea was defeated. And I think there's a lot more support for the idea of a binational state because, face it, the history of Palestine up until 36 and then 48 has been a history of incredible peace between, Muslims and Jews. And in fact, some of the people struggling, particularly in the 1960s, were Sephardic Jews. The Black Panther Party in Israel was Sephardic Jews, That's not to say there wasn't inequality or resistance, but that there's a long tradition of peace. And so we get this myth in our heads that these people can't be in the same place. It's just such a bogus myth. And we forget the long history of the Israeli left that have been pushing for something much more democratic. And one other thing to remember, and I'm just rambling here, but I think it's important, is that when Israel came into being in 48, the US administration wasn't too happy about that. See, we think of it as like always it's because they're in bed. But no, the reason why, because it wasn't clear what the social democratic structure of Israel would be. Israel was on a path to socialism. It was considered a left, rogue space. All these people were there, and in fact, the possibilities for real democratic just society were there. And then things happened. That's not to deny the real history of the Nakba, the dispossession, but to say that, part of what could have been, just like what could have been Iraq, what could have been a lot of these places, always leads to the death and destruction of the left in favor of something else. See, so we don't even know what could have been. And so the question, here's the test. The test is who in Israel or Palestine or wherever, in occupied territories, who will stand up and say, this is unjust, and we will resist it, and this is unacceptable, okay? That's the question. Just like the United States, Montgomery bus boycott. There weren't like a whole lot of white people coming to the fore to defend the right to boycott. But there were some. And those some are the ones we have to pay attention to and support, as well, if that makes sense. Now, of course, here come the floodgates of questions about. Yes? Oh, in the back, and then you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kelley. For those of us involved in a critical prison study, we imagine prison as a central project to American democracy, especially Jacksonian democracy. Eastern State Penitentiary, you have folks like do Tocqueville coming over and visiting all kinds of places, including the penitentiary. And
de Tocqueville, really?
Yes, yes.
Interesting. What does he say?
He finds it horrible. But it's interesting that a number of Europeans would come over and visit, among other places, the United States Penitentiary. I'm curious, considering that the United States is now building 2 prisons in Haiti, about how you imagine maybe the prison as a kind of project of the expansion of democracy.
Of the expansion of democracy?
Yes.
You mean in the same way that I talked about empire?
Yes.
Because of course I didn't actually talk that part through, because and everyone hopefully figured out that the argument that there is a democratic empire is a myth. It's just not true. And it's based on the idea of social Darwinism, essentially. In fact, one of the things that Franklin Givens argues is that democratic empire is necessary. We have the expansion of empire and democracy simultaneously, right? These happen simultaneously. But the end result is a kind of citizenship extended to subject peoples. What is not at the end of the tunnel is sovereignty. Okay? So if we think of what the prison represents, okay? I'm sorry. Oh, it's my daughter. I feel bad. I hate not talking to her. She never calls me, so it's like. But think about this way. Does the idea of incarceration, even if people believe it was some kind of civilizing project, nobody believes that. No one believes that. What they do believe, though, is that it is a mode of protection for those on the outside. The prison is containerization for redundant labor force and for people who are criminalized and considered rendered obsolete. But it plays a key role for those on the outside. See, and that, I think, is the issue. If the United States says that we can go into other countries and we could create security and protection for you, that's not new. That is old. That is the Dominican Republic. That is Haiti. That is Nicaragua. And what is interesting is that when you read most histories of the period of occupation, with some exceptions, they always point to the bad and the good. The good is eliminating malaria and other kinds. The good is road building. Oh, how good is that? Not that they took the money out the coffers of the state to pay for it, but they did all these good things. So the argument is that you could build prisons as a good thing, as a way to protect and secure people's lives. But if you do something else too, that is, who works as the prison guards? They hire people. They provide jobs. This is the big myth of prison construction in California. That's going to provide jobs, it's going to get California economy going back again. And Ruthie Gilmore proves that that's not the case at all. Especially when the idea of local jobs is kind of a myth when they're also using low-wage immigrant undocumented labor or documented labor, but low-wage labor nonetheless. So, yeah, and there's all kinds of ways you could justify sort of U.S. Intervention and presence as a good thing. I'm curious about the de Tocqueville story, though, because de Tocqueville, as much as he might have abhorred inequality, and he ultimately did support the idea that the only way you're going to have a democracy in America is to make it a white democracy. That was his position. Someone else? Yes?
As a TA in history of civil rights, we taught Vince Harness open history.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he got an anecdote of a reporter in Tiananmen Square asking a Chinese student what, if they would like some advice from American civil rights workers. And the response that the student gave was only if they're advanced ideas about democracy. And when I brought this up in class, one of my students asked me that question. What are your ideas? What are your ideas about, how do you feel about advanced ideas of democracy? How do you define that? I just figured I'd pose that question to you.
Yeah, what are advanced ideas? Well, what do you think he meant by that, though, out of curiosity? No, not so much what you meant, but what do you think when he responded to Vincent with that, so what do you think he meant?
I think that the student in Tiananmen Square.
Right.
I think he was challenging, saying that yes, we've seen what that is, but that we've seen what the civil rights workers are progressing and what they're putting forth, but that's not really indicative of what America is about and what they're professing. So they're saying American democracy is kind of in the box. We're not really looking, not seeing the American civil rights workers' ideas about a more open and expansive idea about democracy.
Right. Well, it's a really great question because I think that there are very few that I'm familiar with, very few post-World War II revolts, revolutions, even nationalist movements that said, we're going to take the United States as our model. In fact, I don't think there's anyone that said we're going to take anyone as a model. And the power and beauty of the non-aligned movement, whatever its limitations, was that they were trying to develop new models and new relationships and new ways of thinking about democracy. Part of it has to do with the fact that there was a sense that the whole Western project failed, completely failed. I mean, imagine, what does the world look like post-Holocaust? When everything that was told to you about Western superiority basically comes down to the use of technology to have the greatest mass killing in the history of the world, right? A mass killing the practice of which was already in the colonies before that. So there was, that's why Fanon ends Wretched Years. He says, look, it's the third world that is the future. Now, of course, that project was defeated, and the best study of this, as far as I'm concerned, is anything Vijay Prashad writes, lays it out. And Vijay has a new book coming out called The Poor Nations, which is the most brilliant thing I've ever seen on a page. It's just amazing. But part of it is, this is the vision, but he shows it wasn't just the internal failures of democracy in these countries. I mean, some of it is, oligarch people who are greedy, who use the state coffers for whatever means, but it's also a defeat. It was a defeat because part of it had to do with the use of debt as a way to leverage power and to really bring nations, under. Part of it has to do with the combination of both Soviet and U.S. Participation and intervention in trade union movements, in undermining democratic practices at the local level. That's not to say that these places would have been successful. It's to say that trying to build advanced democracy under duress, under external pressures, is a very hard thing to do. Now, I think that in asking that question, what does advanced democracy look like? I don't have a clue. All I know is that from my political vantage point, we cannot bracket social and economic issues from political issues. And that's part of it. The realm of the social and the realm of the economic has been sort of ceded to free market. And that is one of the big problems. And the realm of the political is also ceded to the free market too, but that's another story. I think that, some of the most advanced ideas for me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, come out of some of the struggles in Latin America. Autonomistas, the favelas, the local organizing that's community-based, that these are the most advanced examples, expressions of democracy I can think of. And they might be built on old ways, but they're ways in which there's a kind of combination of participatory, deliberative, if you want to call it that, but the participatory democracy and engagement as opposed to strictly representational democracy. Representative Democracy, sorry. Yeah.
Let me try a question and sort of a proposal on this. One of the things I observed in the democratic ideas that you presented was a consistent identification of young people as actually participants. So whether it was the push for Vote 18 or the work in SNCC or even IWW. And it was interesting to me that you started with a narrative of democratic education that started with your 7-year-old son,
Right.
who did not make you did not see a distinction between what he understood and what other parents understood. And yet we live in a country where not only will we not recognize the Convention on the Rights of the Child, along with only Somalia, but we have a real problem with thinking about these structures around age and around assumptions. And I actually would like to propose to you something that we have been discussing in the area here, that actually if you really want to think about a democratic revolutionary society, you start with one that enfranchises children.
Absolutely, and I've made that argument before, 15 years ago. It's in print. People thought I was crazy. I said, that why not begin? I put the arbitrary age of 7, begin at 7 years old. I think that's absolutely right, because part of the problem, there's 2 problems. One, we don't even have political education for adults. There's no political education. One, to go back to the question of what advanced democracy look like, we don't even have a conversation about what it is. What we do have are a lot of books that have come out about what's wrong, and that are these alternative narratives of what happened. Oh God, sorry. So there's that. The other thing is that's for adults. For children, we don't even, civics is not really political education. But then we get civics, then we have that. And yet, if you were to challenge them and ask them, what would you do in this circumstance? Or what do you think we should do? They have ideas. It's not like they don't have ideas. The surrealists have been saying, you need to get children involved in political discussions. All of them, everyone, from the time they can begin to talk. Both because they learn, but they also have ideas to contribute. And this is a very, very important part of the problem, or story. One thing that kind of inspired me to think about that, when my daughter, who's now, she's a graduate of college now, but we were checking out a school in New York, it was all public schools, that had a project that all the kids did in 2nd grade, where they would literally work in groups and create their own society, figure out governance, figure out what are rights, what are privileges. They weren't given that language. Now, this is very different from my niece, who went to school where they were given fake dollars and had to choose these fake jobs. And it was all about earning dollars to be able to buy time or buy commodities. Totally different way of thinking. They didn't have any say-so in terms of even the distribution of dollars, or even that dollars would be a means of exchange. But when you create your own society without anything at all, no prep, sure, they draw on what they hear and talk about, but ultimately they come up with all these ideas that ultimately do not have anything to do with exchange, but have to do with communication, and have to do with moral and ethical questions. That is, what is right and what is wrong? What is appropriate speech? What is bad speech? Who's responsible for stuff? How do we all be responsible? That is the natural inclination. I don't think it's natural in the sense that it's like in the genes, but natural in terms of the way social beings interact with one another. The unnatural thing is to be reduced to a commodity, right? But that's what kids are being taught. They're being taught the latter. They're being taught more often, like my niece, than my daughter didn't get into that school, by the way. But I totally agree with you. But we have a lot of work to do. And I think that in order for that to work, it's going to require not doing too much teaching. You know what I mean? Like in this case with my son, they asked me to come to the class, and I ended up doing more teaching. But I also asked a lot of questions and try to get them to think about stuff. But that's different. If I were to sort of deal with them every day on a daily basis, I would have to sort of sit and try to learn from them what they think is an appropriate system of governance for themselves and for their peers, you know. And that also raises one last question, and that is the way we often think about politics, it's always national, or it's global, or it's statewide. In other words, it's big, when some of the great developments were always small, you know. Okay, I gotta take this. Hey, sweetie, I'm right in the middle of my talk. Everyone say hi.
Hi.
Okay, I'm sorry, doing Q&A, and the phone keeps ringing, and so I have to go. Okay, okay, kids, say cool for me. Bye. So, otherwise you're gonna think you're just ignoring me, and then I pay for that. That's different kind of governance. You know? Wait, anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to carry forward my colleague, Professor Lovett's comment. When I think of the 60s and the ferment, it was not only creating model democracies within schools, of which there were various efforts to do that, it's rethinking the whole notion of hierarchy and power. And when we had our revolutions here at the university and in the California system, students fomented, you will, and challenged the whole structure of undemocratic decisions over curriculum, over policies of the university, and so forth. I think many people today would say there's been a decline from whatever even efforts at creating democracy within K through 12, let alone in higher education, and that it really is back to the family, where parents seem to have retreated to a more conservative, authoritarian hovering security notion of family organization, and in which the level of exchange you are talking about has become less rather than more. So my question is this: as we look at these fluctuations of open and close, that you put very well in the struggle, do you see UCLA and the University of California system leading again? Is it possible for them to lead again, let alone other universities and colleges, a return to a more democratic polity?
Definitely not UCLA. I wish. Students, well, there's two things. Let me just a word on UCLA or the whole UC system. It's precisely the UC system's push for more neoliberal policies that have squeezed the students. So the students in some ways are very, very active around issues of student debt, rising tuitions, and things that are happening at the university level, which is very interesting in terms of shutting down speech. That's been a very difficult, challenging issue. Now, that's a small group of students. But of course, you probably remember, in the 1960s, it was never the majority. Never. There's no history of the United States where there's been a majority of anyone doing anything. It's always that sort of core. So I'm confident in the capacity of the students who are very active. But it's interesting, you know, at UCLA, who are the most active students that I work with who are trying to envision? They're students who are most vulnerable. We have undocumented students at UCLA. We have Arab, specifically Palestinian students, who are very, very active, not just on the issue of Palestine, but on issues of all kinds of things. In other words, you get active on one thing, you end up being pulled into other things. That's how it was. You know, you're anti-war, you end up getting pulled into, you know, civil rights or that sort of thing, women's rights. So that's the fact. The other thing is that as the tuitions rise, and as programs like Upward Bound and other programs that actually try to get students from different class backgrounds onto campus, you don't have that class pressure. Sometimes you can come from a very privileged background, but surrounded by the class pressure of other people's experiences can compel you to act. So I'm not saying that just being working class compels you to act. On the contrary, sometimes working class kids are the ones who are so focused on trying to finish. They're not the ones. But the pressure, the presence, the stories, the narratives help you think about like your life. So I wish you said this, but now to go back to the parents, I think you're so right about this. But I would take it even one step further. What we're witnessing is the intrusion or the sort of the success of the U.S. national security state. And how does it work? Go back to the prisons. We have more prisons in California anywhere. The prisons, like I said, function not just to warehouse human beings, but to generate fear. That's why voters go to the polls and they vote for bond measures that can keep funding prisons. If you are afraid in your neighborhood, then you're going to be afraid to engage your neighbors. So the kind of relationships are that. If you're afraid of your neighborhood, you're going to be afraid to let your kids out to play. So all children, a particular class, are moved through machines. They move through the city through machines. Put them in cars, you drop them off, take them there, take them there. And then they don't know how to engage other children. They watch television and they learn that the best way to engage is through performance. Performance means you can't hear. You don't listen, you don't create games. The games that require sociality, the relationships that are really necessary, those things disappear. So what do? Your kid goes crazy. Your kid gets like oppositional defiant disorder. And then you call an expert, a therapist who then takes you to parenting classes that UCLA offers. You go to the parenting classes and you learn all these things about how to deal with your child without your child there. Then you send your child to another group therapy thing, and then they're trying to learn how to be social, the thing that play actually does, right? It's completely dysfunctional. So the possibilities of breaking from the national security consciousness are almost just impossible. You know, it's insurmountable, I think. You know, and let me tell you, I know this vortex from experience. I'm not channeling someone else. So that was also, the whole thing becomes a cottage industry. And that cottage industry is part of the kind of neoliberal sort of formation. It's part of the free market. Yes.
Thank you. Really great talk. You covered a lot. And I just kind of want to pick up on these questions because, I think a lot of us struggle with a certain kind of question of strategy and how to galvanize energy for change when the picture is so bleak. And it just now veered into a very bleak corner.
I'm sorry about
you
that.
found yourself saying, you can't see any way out practically.
Yeah, I shouldn't say
so,
that.
Yeah, and so the question really has to do with how and whether and how to not just to demystify American history, but to mobilize certain myths for progressive causes. And for me, the classic historical instance of this is when Frederick Douglass decides that Wendell Phillips' reading of the Constitution and its history, which is also Chief Justice Roger Taney's reading, which is also Charles Mills's reading, looking back from our perspective, he says, well, sotto voce probably, he says, yeah, they're right. But we can't really give up on politics. We can't cede the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to the slaveholders and the apologists for Southern slavery, even though from a strictly historicist perspective, Taney and Wendell Phillips were correct. So as intellectuals, I think we inherit this problem that Douglass himself was dealing with. Like, how do we retrieve some responsibly, some conception of the U.S. past? I know she used American, not U.S., by the way.
And I said U.S. a lot, though.
I know, but I think you actually got it. You didn't say the rise of American democracy, because for the very same reason that you didn't want to just like let everyone like, well, why would we go? He doesn't believe in any of these words at all anyway. So, so that's really, you get my question. So I'm wondering how you struggle with that question and really what you might share as to like how you thought it through and where you are with it
Right.
now.
Well, it's so funny. That's an excellent question. It's the essential question. And I guess my position is that I feel like my talk is incredibly optimistic. And this is why. Because, and maybe if I were hanging out with Douglas in the 1850s, it was the 1840s, I might have disagreed with him. I probably, my reading would be more like David Walker, Constitution. But the main theme of my talk, hopefully, is that we actually got here not from the architects of the drafters of the Constitution or the Declaration, but all those struggles produced it. That what ended up happening was that, yes, Roger Taney was right in the end. That's why he needed the 14th Amendment. He wasn't wrong. And the Constitution had to change, and it did change. And the political space did change through struggle on the ground, not through being smart. Not to say that the people on the ground weren't really smart, they were. But in other words, it wasn't the lecture or the critique that won. It won it on the ground. And that won it on all these different fronts. Not just, I skip the New Deal, for example. I think Liz Cohen is right and others are right, that the New Deal wasn't sort of Roosevelt's master plan to save capitalism. It might have done that, but it was also a negotiated settlement. It was a struggle to basically expand the welfare state. I use Keynesian sometimes, but I use it as a shorthand because it's like, when you play standards, the changes for Cherokee, right? I don't think it's a Keynesian state. I actually think it's the people's state. In other words, it was this negotiated settlement that Keynes might have been like the sort of visionary economist who had an idea about deficit spending and spending on infrastructure and continuing the economy that way in consumption. But I think what actually happened was organized labor at every level insisted that these are the things that we need. Unemployed movements demanded that these are the things we need, and if we don't get it, there will be trouble. And it was a victory. If you take the 1960s, I talked about the defeats, because I want to talk about defeats only because we don't talk about them. But the victories of the 60s also included all those urban rebellions that, and the national welfare rights movement combined expanded the welfare state even more to the point where it forced someone like President Nixon to actually even imagine a guaranteed annual income. That was one. It wasn't that Nixon was such a good guy, because he wasn't. He just wasn't. So my point is that we don't even need to mobilize the myth. All we have to do is know the history of struggle and know that we can win, but also know that sometimes we lose, but in losing, what do we gain? And this is where Frederick Douglass were here, I would say, look, you were wrong about the Constitution. You were right about the fact that power concedes nothing without demand. And that was the demand. You were also right that the contradictions of slavery itself, the slave power, the crisis of the 1850s, the issue of expansion, competition with free labor, and most importantly, the fact that, no matter what we think about abolitionists, and the fact that some of the great abolitionists were also the Republicans who pushed to jack up labor's conditions and rights, but abolition was a political movement that actually had been pushing for the end of slavery even before the Civil War, And I think that's a correct position. But those abolitionists were pulled by the nose or led in some ways by those enslaved people and free black people who said, we will not leave to go to Africa because until this struggle is over. We will not leave our sister and brother behind. And if we go to Canada, it's only to be close enough to fight back, right? That is the history of our struggle, and that's the history of democracy. The final thing I would say about this is that one of the strange things that happens when we tell this history is that we get locked in a kind of identity politics that treats these struggles as parallel struggles, not one. And so that's why I begin by saying, look, we think the Voting Rights Act is a black thing. We think Reconstruction was a black thing. Just because black people lead it doesn't make it a black thing. It means it's for everybody. And so the ways in which struggles for freedoms on the part of all these different people open the pathway for everybody. You know, that is the thing that needs to be acknowledged, because if you do that, then we end up not thinking that we have to find leadership or take leadership from people who we think are more important or more powerful than us. Does that make sense? So I appreciate it. Okay.
I think we should let you off the.
Oh, I know
You
you
got
had-
one more? One more.
Yeah, that question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'll be quick.
You kind of touched on it with the U.S. tyranny abroad, stuff like the xenophobia, which we can see today with Islamophobia and stuff. And kind of you can see that even the citizen fascination with spectacle, you talked about that. I just wanted to see kind of your thoughts. If you couple that with kind of current talks about the rise of executive power, you have the Patriot Act with wiretapping and all that, and you know, wars on terrorism, which is an existential thing. You also see kind of it's like a criminalization of dissent almost, or even a silencing. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. That's a very, very good question, and I think there's a couple things. One, that the criminalization of dissent is the history of the United States from its inception. The anti-sedition laws of 1790 are good examples. And this is the thing that's so interesting, is that despite anti-sedition, despite the criminalization of dissent, movements continue to flourish and thrive. And the evidence is that no anti-sedition laws and there are not enough drones in the world to stop movements that are committed. And I think that's important. The other thing is that in terms of presidential power, you hit it on the head. You know, even MSNBC has short-term memory. And I think you can begin to see the expansion of presidential power, certainly with Teddy Roosevelt. Sometimes we don't think, if we like what someone's doing, we're like, oh, that's okay expansion. If we don't like what they're doing, that's bad expansion. But it's all expansion. So you begin with Theodore Roosevelt, who, if you look at when he ran as a progressive in 1912, look at the platform, it's pretty extraordinary. It's amazingly progressive, like radical. But this is also the president who, in terms of U.S. intervention and foreign policy, his record is certainly not better than Obama, whose record is just atrocious. So, I mean, in other words, it's not like apples and oranges, it's all part of the same human being. But you get this expansion of presidential power throughout the 20th century. This has been the trajectory. And of course, Obama is not willing to give up the presidential powers that have been expanded dramatically under Bush II, you know. And one of the things, just one last little story I have to tell you, because to me the expansion of presidential power, as dangerous as it is, and it is dangerous, is not as dangerous as the common sense that we've come to accept about the national security state and the role of secrecy. And I'll give you a very close home example. My mother-in-law was arguing with me till she was blue in the face, and she says, you know, you need to stop criticizing our president. He knows things that we don't know, and so therefore you need to cut him some slack. So the argument is that because he knows secrets that we're not privy to, that's okay for him to behave the way he's behaving, or his cabinet to behave the way they're behaving. It means that we have ceded the right to information. And meanwhile, you've got Bradley Manning, and if you've heard, I wish I could see that 35-page speech that he gave. I hear part of it's extraordinary. If you think about Bradley Manning's incarceration and what it represents for our moment, it's like everybody needs to sort of look up and figure out what he's doing and support him. Because he's simply doing what we're supposed to be doing. And that is, if a democratic society is about disclosure and openness and access to information, particularly information that really does not undermine U.S. security, it may or may not, depending on how you define it, but it's not putting anyone in danger. But what it does is a critique. It's a critique of U.S. military practice. It's a critique of occupation. It's a critique of war. And it's done with such grace and such courage and done in a way that is appropriate. And yet, we have, my mother-in-law and all these other people say, you know, if safety, if we have to defend ourselves from those Muslims who are going to attack us, if it means not knowing, I'd rather not know. The mere fact that we think that's going to happen is evidence that the ideology of the national security state is winning, and we've got to undermine that. One last final thing, and that is, this is something I say a lot, but I think I have to repeat it. For those of us who feel a sense of pessimism about the future, I always say that in 1855, nobody knew that within 10 years, slavery would be over and done. In 1959, no one knew what was going to happen in the mid-60s in terms of like this real democratic struggle. In other words, we're sometimes on the eve of things where things look so terrible, in the midst of the Cold War and Red Scare repression. We don't know what's going to erupt, you know? And sometimes we're right there with the eruption. But if we assume that we can actually win through collective, unified action and through critical thinking and engagement, then we need to act. We just need to act, you know, because you just never know. Thank you.